welcome to the shop. A little chilly in here today. We're going to be talking about circular saw basics. You know, when I first started out doing all woodworking projects, I couldn't afford all the big hotshot saws like the miter saw and the table saw, but I certainly could afford a good circular saw. Now, I use my circular saw for all types of cutting. I cut through 2x4s, 2x6s, plywood, veneers, masonry, decking materials. Well, I've even been known to cut some decorative trim in my days with my circular saw, but very carefully. Now, the price range as far as purchasing a circular saw can vary quite a bit. From your lower end, which is usually around $60, up to your higher end saws, which are starting about $130. Those are your professional grade saws. Now, what's the difference between the cost? Power. The more money, of course, and it goes by amps. Now, when you look at a saw, on the actual motor itself, it'll tell you the type of amperage it has. For your lower end saws, you're going to start at about 10 amps. For your higher end, it goes up to 15 amps. So you want to look at that. So the more money you spend, of course, the more power. Now, when you go to a home center store, the saw type you're going to see itself, as far as the diameter of the blade, is generally a 7¼ inch diameter blade. And you can see that right on the circular saw itself, or it's stamped right on the blade. So you know exactly what size blades you're going to be using or purchasing for the future when you're buying blades for your saw. Now, it usually is a pretty good saw as far as cutting through thick materials. You can almost cut up to 2 inches with a circular saw making one pass. So that's pretty good. It's a good sized blade. Some of the features of the saw, well, of course, the plate, or the shoe as it's called. This is what the saw rests on as you're cutting through some stock. Every saw has a release for the blade itself, or for the shoe, so that you can move the plate up and down. And what this will help you do is determine the depth of the blade, so when you're making a cut, you have your blade set at the right height. Another thing, of course, you always want to make sure that's locked. All the saws have a bevel release, and what this does, it allows you to move the plate so that you can cut angles or miters on your saw. Safety feature is this blade guard. Now, mainly what this is for is accidental contact for the blade itself as you're cutting. As you're cutting through a piece of material, once you've made it pass all the way through, that blade's going to drop down, and you can set your saw down on table safely, and it won't allow any contact with the blade. Now, another feature that I really like is this actually a blade lock. Now, what this is useful for is when you go to change a blade, you engage the blade so that it's locked, and that allows you to take your wrench that comes with the saw itself and loosen or tighten this nut that actually holds the blade in place, so you can easily remove and change out your blades. Now, as far as blades, usually what happens when you get a circular saw in the box, it's going to give you a standard cutting blade or a basic blade, and that's usually about 20 teeth. What these are good for, this one actually says 18, so 18 to 20. What these are good for is basically fast cutting. It's not a very smooth cut, but it's a perfect cut if you're cutting some plywood, if you're cutting any type of stock. Now, you can purchase other blades for the type of material that you're going to be cutting. There's masonry blades, of course. There's decking blades. There's even plywood blades, and I have one here that I find very slick. This actually has 150 teeth, and this is perfect for veneers and plywoods, and it gives you a nice smooth cut, and it doesn't have any ripping. So there are all sorts of blades you're going to look for. Now, as far as the type of blade, there are steel blades, which is a steel material, of course, and then there's carbide tip blades. Now, I spend a little bit more money on my blades, and I buy carbide tips because they last longer and they don't need sharpened as much. Now, there are places that you can take your blade to get sharpened, but if you are careful on how you treat your blades and how you store your saw, you shouldn't have any problem as far as your blade life. Now, another thing about the saw that I wanted to talk about is how powerful it is. This is a very powerful tool. Of course, you can do a lot of damage with it, and mainly to yourself. So there are some safety tips I want to share with you before you get started using your saw. Setting the proper blade depth is the first step taken before starting to cut. Proper blade depth will minimize kickback. When cutting 2x4s, for instance, unplug the saw and adjust the blade to a depth that leaves the lowest tooth no more than about 1/8 of an inch beneath the wood. Always mark the cut line with a pencil and a square. Now I like to use a roofing square for this and the next step. Guide the saw along the edge of the square. Now this step has two purposes. First, if the saw goes out of line during the cut, the blade could bind the saw and it could kick back at you. The square will also ensure a nice smooth cut. Make sure that the broadest part of the base is on the keep side of the wood you are cutting. Never lift the saw while the blade is still moving. Finish your cut completely through the wood until the offcut drops free, then stop the saw. Now when cutting plywood, always support the plywood by using 2x4 supports over a pair of sawhorses. This will eliminate the plywood from flexing during the cut. If the plywood flexes too much, the cut edges could pinch the blade, which will result in kickbacks. Adjust your blade so that there are just enough teeth to cut through the material. The less blade, the less likelihood of pinching should the ply flex. Now always cut with the plywood good face facing down, because a circular saw cuts cleanest where the teeth are entering the wood. Use a straight edge to guide the saw. Now I keep a long straight pieces of 1x2 that I can clamp with my quick release clamps. There are straight edge guides that you can purchase, but you know what? I have great luck with this setup. Okay, if you're interested in purchasing a circular saw, you can go to a home center store and actually do a couple of test drives. Now sometimes they actually have manufacturer reps that will come to the store and actually show their circular saws or all their line of power tools, so keep an eye on that. You can even ask at the front counter if they're going to have a demonstration like that. Play with all sorts of different models. You may feel comfortable with one as opposed to another, but it's just one of those things that becomes a personal preference. I tell you what, this is a very indispensable tool, and once you find the right one, I'm sure you're going to have years of good use for it. Enjoy.